The first encounter. The year was 2170, and humanity had found itself caught in the throes of an endless war. The planet Earth, once a beacon of peace and prosperity, now stood at the edge of survival against an alien species known as the Xeon. These invaders were not like the stories of extraterrestrial life humanity had imagined. They were cold, calculating, and relentless. With their vast fleets and advanced technology, they had already decimated several human colonies and threatened the very existence of Earth. Captain Jackson Reyes had been at the forefront of humanity's resistance. A former soldier who had seen the horrors of war firsthand, he had become a symbol of hope for his people. His sharp mind and strategic prowess made him an invaluable leader. But what truly set Jackson apart was his deep belief in humanity's resilience, that even in the face of overwhelming odds, Earth could fight back. One day, a strange mission was assigned to him, to oversee the interrogation of an alien prisoner. The prisoner was a Xeon soldier named Erin, one of their fiercest warriors, captured after a brutal assault on a human outpost. It was said that she had slaughtered dozens of soldiers in a matter of minutes, her alien physiology making her a terrifying force on the battlefield. No one knew how she had been captured, and whispers spread that it was nothing short of a miracle. But Jackson was not concerned with how she had been taken. He was more interested in why. The interrogation room was cold, lit by harsh overhead lights that cast long shadows on the walls. Erin sat in the center of the room, shackled to a steel chair, her skin a smooth shade of pale gray, marked with intricate patterns that glowed faintly in the dark. Her eyes, sharp and alien, burned with anger and hatred, focusing on Jackson as he entered the room. The moment their eyes met, an invisible tension filled the air, thick with centuries of distrust and animosity. Jackson stood across from her, studying her carefully. He was a tall man, with short-cropped dark hair and a well-defined jaw. His uniform was pristine, the insignia of Earth's military gleaming on his chest. He had faced many challenges, but this was different. This was a creature from another world, a warrior who had come to Earth with the sole purpose of destroying everything Jackson had sworn to protect. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Erin's eyes narrowed, and Jackson could feel the weight of her hatred. It was palpable, like a physical force pushing against him. But he remained calm, his expression unreadable. "I don't want to do this," Jackson finally said, his voice steady. "I don't want to fight you." Erin snorted, her lips curling into a sneer. "You humans are weak. You think you can reason with me. I was born to destroy your kind. My people have wiped out entire worlds, and yours will be no different." Jackson's expression softened, but his resolve remained firm. "You're wrong. We fight to survive, not to destroy. We don't seek war, but we will not back down when our home is threatened. That's something you'll never understand." For a moment, Erin seemed taken aback. Her eyes flickered, and Jackson caught a glimpse of something other than pure rage. Confusion, perhaps, or a flicker of doubt. She quickly masked it, her gaze hardening again. "You think you're different," she said, her voice low and cold. "But you're just like every other species. Flesh-eating, power-hungry, driven only by your need to dominate." Jackson took a slow step forward, never breaking eye contact. "We're not all the same. I know what you've been taught, but I'm telling you, there's more to us than what you see on the surface. We have compassion, we have empathy, and we fight for each other, even when the odds are stacked against us." Erin tilted her head slightly, her alien features betraying the slightest hint of curiosity. Jackson could feel her resistance beginning to crack, even if only a little. He wasn't sure if it was his words or the raw honesty in his voice, but for the first time, Erin seemed to be considering something beyond the propaganda she had been raised with. "I didn't come here to change your mind," Jackson said, breaking the silence. "But I want you to know that we'll keep fighting. And if you're still alive after this war, if you ever get the chance to leave, know this: Earth won't be what you expect. We don't fight for conquest. We fight for survival. And that's something no one can take away from us. Erin's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but before she could respond, the door to the room slid open, and a team of military personnel entered, interrupting the moment. Jackson nodded to them, signaling that the conversation was over. But as he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had planted a seed, a small spark of doubt in Erin's mind that might grow into something more. He left the room, the sound of the door sliding shut behind him. Outside, the war raged on, and the fate of Earth hung in the balance. But Jackson couldn't help but wonder if this strange encounter might mark the beginning of something much bigger than just a fight for survival. Shifting allegiances, the days that followed the first meeting between Captain Jackson Reyes and the alien soldier Erin were tense. Jackson continued his daily visits to the holding cell, though his superiors urged him to focus on the war efforts rather than waste time with a prisoner. The war between humanity and the Xeon had escalated, and every second spent on a captive felt like a second loss to the relentless enemy. Yet Jackson couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something more to this war, something he couldn't quite grasp. In the quiet moments between battles, Jackson's thoughts would wander back to Erin. Despite her aggressive nature and the years of hatred that ran deep in her veins, there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes, a sign that she might not be as resolute in her mission as he had once believed. Each time he entered the interrogation room, he tried to probe deeper, speaking to her not as an enemy, but as someone seeking understanding. But Erin remained stubbornly silent, unwilling to give any ground. The third time Jackson visited her, something was different. When he walked into the room, he noticed Erin's posture had shifted. Instead of sitting rigidly, she was slouched, her hands still bound but her expression far less hostile. She looked tired, almost broken. Her eyes, usually sharp and full of contempt, were now dulled by exhaustion. "How are you feeling today?" Jackson asked, trying to keep his tone neutral, though the change in her demeanor made him uneasy. Erin didn't look at him right away. Her gaze remained fixed on the floor, her jaw clenched tightly. For a moment, Jackson wondered if she was retreating back into her usual anger. But then she spoke. Her voice was low and full of bitterness. "I'm fine," she muttered, though there was no conviction in her words. Jackson leaned forward slightly. "If you're fine, why are you here? Why are you still fighting a war that only brings destruction?" Erin's eyes finally met his, and for the first time, Jackson saw something more than disdain. He saw a deep, aching sorrow. "Because it's all I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was bred to fight. My people are born for war, for conquest. It's in our blood. I don't know any other way of life." Jackson took a step closer, his heart pounding. This was the opening he had been waiting for. But what if there's another way? What if you didn't have to live like that? What if you could choose something else? Erin scoffed, shaking her head. "You think I have a choice? You think any of us have a choice in this? The Xeon are not like you, human. We don't have the luxury of choosing peace. We have been at war for centuries. It's what we were born into." For a moment, there was silence. Jackson could feel the weight of her words, the unshakable sense of duty that had been instilled in her since birth. But even so, he couldn't stop the burning desire to offer her something more, something better than the endless violence. "Maybe that's true," Jackson said softly. "But every soldier, every person, has the ability to choose who they become. You're not just a weapon, Erin. You're a person. You can decide to be more than just a soldier of war." Erin's eyes softened ever so slightly, but she quickly looked away, unwilling to let her guard down. "You don't understand. The war isn't just something we fight, it's something we are. If we stop, if we try to change, we'll lose everything. My people won't allow it." Jackson's voice was firm. "Then maybe it's time for you to stop thinking about what your people will do and start thinking about what you want. If we keep going down this path, we'll all be destroyed. Both of our worlds. There has to be another way." Erin fell silent again, her shoulders slumping as she seemed to weigh his words. Jackson waited, knowing that he couldn't force her to change her mind. He could only offer her the possibility of something else. The next day, things took an unexpected turn. A high-ranking officer, Colonel Marcus Steele, entered the facility. The stern, calculating officer had been suspicious of Jackson's growing interest in the prisoner, but Jackson had always justified it as a tactical need. Now, with the war raging at full force, Marcus seemed determined to put an end to what he viewed as a distraction. "Captain Rice, I've had enough of this," Marcus said with a cold tone as he entered the room. "You're wasting time with this alien. The war needs your attention, not some prisoner who should have been executed the moment we caught her." Jackson stood up straight, meeting Marcus's gaze with a calm but defiant expression. "With all due respect, Colonel, there's more at stake here than just winning a battle. If we can change the mind of one soldier, one alien, maybe we can change the course of this war." Marcus's eyes narrowed, clearly not buying the sentiment. "You've gone soft, Reyes. This is a fight for survival, not a diplomatic mission." But Jackson wasn't about to back down. Maybe surviving isn't enough anymore. Marcus scowled, clearly unimpressed. "Do whatever you want with her, but I'm pulling you off this assignment. You've got more important things to focus on." As Marcus left the room, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been given an ultimatum. The higher-ups were losing patience, and if Jackson didn't produce results soon, he might lose his chance to make any real difference, not just for the war, but for Erin as well. Little did Jackson know, Erin was already beginning to wrestle with her own doubts. The words he had said to her, the notion that she could choose a different path, were starting to echo in her mind. Was it possible to break free from the violence of her people? Could she truly change, or was she doomed to follow the path laid out for her? As the days passed, the cracks in her resolve deepened. Erin had been raised to view humanity as nothing more than prey. Flesh-eating, war-hungry creatures who existed only to be destroyed. But now, for the first time, she wasn't so sure. There was something about Jackson, something about the humans he represented, that made her question everything. The war, it seemed, was not just a battle of armies. It was a battle for the hearts and minds of those who fought in it. And maybe, just maybe, Erin was starting to see a glimmer of hope for a different future. A future where she could choose who she wanted to be. A bond forged in fire. As the days wore on, the tension between Jackson Reyes and Erin. "I've been thinking," Erin began, her voice barely audible. Her gaze was distant, as though her mind was racing through thoughts she'd never allowed herself to entertain before. "Maybe you're right. Maybe there's more to humanity than what I've been told." She paused, as though unsure of how to continue. "But what happens after this war ends? If your people and mine are left to rebuild what's been broken, will we ever be able to trust each other? Will your people forgive us for all the death and destruction we've caused?" Jackson leaned in slightly, his tone softer than usual. "That's the real question, isn't it? Will we ever trust each other again? But I think it starts with understanding, and understanding starts with people like you and me. If we can find common ground, if we can show that we're not so different, then maybe we have a shot at rebuilding what was lost." Erin shook her head slowly, her long silver hair falling over her shoulder. "I don't know. We were taught to see humans as nothing more than prey. Your people aren't the first species we've destroyed. There are more, countless worlds that the Xeon have annihilated. We are conquerors, Jackson. It's what we do. It's all we've ever done." Jackson's eyes softened with sympathy. I know what your people have done. But you're not just a tool of war, Erin. You're a person, and you can choose to be something more than a weapon." Erin's eyes flickered with a mix of skepticism and something else, uncertainty. For the first time in their conversations, she allowed herself to truly question everything she had known about her race, her mission, and the war they were waging. She had never been taught to think beyond the orders she was given, but Jackson's words had planted a seed of doubt. a doubt that was growing stronger with each passing day. The conversation was interrupted when the door to the room suddenly opened. A voice, harsh and commanding, rang out, making both of them jump. "Captain Rice, you're needed immediately. There's been a breach in the eastern sector." It was one of the guards, looking at Jackson with a sense of urgency. Jackson's heart skipped a beat, the sudden change in tone pulling him out of his moment with Erin. He stood up quickly, but before he could walk out, Erin's voice stopped him. "Jackson," she said, her voice steady, though a trace of emotion lingered. "If something happens to you, if you don't come back, don't let this war define us. Don't let it be the end of everything." Jackson paused, turning to face her, a mixture of surprise and gratitude in his expression. "I won't let it be the end, Erin. But if it comes to that, I'll die knowing I tried. I tried to see you, not as the enemy, but as a person. And I hope, one day, that we'll both see the possibility for a better future." He didn't wait for a response. The door slammed shut behind him as he rushed out to face the chaos unfolding outside. His heart was heavy, knowing that with each passing minute, the war was pulling them closer to its inevitable conclusion. But in the back of his mind, a tiny flicker of hope remained. It was a hope born from their conversations, from the unlikely bond that had begun to form between him and Erin. No matter what the war threw at them, he was determined to fight not just for Earth, but for the possibility of peace, even if it meant challenging everything he had been taught to believe. The situation outside was dire. The Zeon had launched a surprise attack on a key military outpost. Jackson raced to the front lines, his mind already shifting into strategy mode. But as he surveyed the battlefield, he couldn't shake the feeling that the enemy they were fighting wasn't just an external force. It was the very ideology that had led both sides to this point, a belief that might makes right, that survival could only come through domination. And if they didn't find a way to break that cycle, both sides would eventually destroy each other. As Jackson led his troops into battle, he could feel the weight of the decisions ahead of him. Every move he made was a step closer to an uncertain future. But one thing was clear. He couldn't let this war define them. Not if he had anything to say about it. The turning point. The battle was fierce, unlike any Jackson had ever experienced. The Zeon forces had launched a full-scale assault on a strategically vital communications hub, and their soldiers fought with relentless precision. Jackson's mind raced as he took command, barking orders over the comms, guiding his troops through the chaos. The sound of gunfire, explosions, and distant screams filled the air, but Jackson remained focused, his every thought on protecting Earth's future. Amid the frenzy of war, however, a new urgency surged within him. The brief conversation he had shared with Erin before the attack had planted something deep inside. The realization that, if they were to win this war, it wouldn't just be about conquering the enemy. It would be about finding common ground, about convincing others that there was a different way to win, one that didn't involve the total destruction of both sides. As much as he needed to fight in the moment, Jackson couldn't forget the bigger picture. He had to find Erin again. He had to show her that there was another way, even if it meant risking everything. But war had a way of clouding thoughts, of obscuring ideals. The chaos of battle soon pulled him back into the present as his forces were pushed to their limits. The Zeon soldiers were relentless, and their numbers seemed endless. Yet Jackson fought with a new fire in his chest, determined not only for victory but for the possibility of peace. Hours passed before the last of the Zeon forces retreated, leaving the humans to secure the hub. Jackson wiped the sweat from his brow, his uniform torn and blood-stained from the fight. As the adrenaline began to wear off, a deep exhaustion set in, but there was no time to rest. The war was still ongoing, and their forces would need all the strength they could muster to keep the fight going. Just as he was about to turn back to his command post, a message blinked across his comm unit. It was a priority signal from Colonel Marcus Steele. "Rise, report to the command center immediately. We have new intel on the alien threat." Jackson's heart sank. He knew that Marcus's new intel was never good news. Still, he couldn't afford to ignore it. As he made his way to the command center, his thoughts drifted back to Erin. He hadn't been able to speak to her since their last encounter, and he feared the time for dialogue might be running out. But the weight of his duty pressed on him. He couldn't afford to be distracted now, not while humanity's survival was at stake. When Jackson entered the command center, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Officers and analysts crowded around a large holographic map, pointing at blinking red dots marking the locations of Xeon troop movements. Marcus Steele stood at the center, his arms crossed over his chest, a stern look etched into his face. "Captain Rice, glad you could join us," Marcus said dryly, his voice like ice. "We've intercepted communications between the Xeon High Command. They've mobilized a massive fleet. Their target is Earth's central defense grid. If they succeed, we'll be defenseless." Jackson's mind raced as he processed the information. If the Xeon breached the defense grid, it would be a catastrophic blow to humanity's chances. The city would be vulnerable, and their most important defense systems would be wiped out in an instant. "What's the plan?" Jackson asked, his voice steady despite the looming sense of dread. "We've assembled a task force," Marcus replied, pulling up a series of coordinates on the holographic map. "You'll lead the ground assault, while a separate fleet handles the airstrike. Your mission is to disable the Xeon's forces on the surface. We can't let them breach the grid." Jackson nodded grimly. "Understood. We'll move out immediately." But just as he turned to leave, Marcus's voice stopped him. "Rise, there's something else. We've been monitoring the prisoner, Erin. We have reason to believe she's trying to escape." The words hit Jackson like a punch to the gut. Erin. Escape? It didn't make sense. He had been so focused on the war and their fragile conversations that he hadn't considered the possibility that she might try to flee. "Are you certain?" Jackson asked, his tone sharp. "Yes," Marcus said coldly. "She's been communicating with someone outside of the facility. It's clear she's plotting something. I thought you might want to know before you get too involved in the assault." Jackson's chest tightened with worry. He didn't know why Erin would betray him, but deep down, he feared it was because of the pressure from her people. The Xeon were known for their ruthless approach, and it seemed that nothing would change that. Despite the surge of concern, Jackson knew his mission had to come first. "I'll deal with Erin after the assault. We can't afford any distractions right now." Marcus didn't say anything, but his sharp eyes lingered on Jackson, as though questioning his loyalty to the mission over the alien prisoner. Jackson had never liked Marcus, and this was one of those moments where the colonel's cold pragmatism was grating. But Jackson wasn't going to let that derail him. He had made a commitment to Erin, and no matter what happened, he wouldn't break it. The ground assault was brutal. Jackson's team fought through waves of Xeon soldiers, each battle more ferocious than the last. The city's streets were now a maze of crumbled buildings and burning debris, but they couldn't afford to slow down. The defense grid had to be protected at all costs. Through the smoke and fire, Jackson's thoughts kept drifting back to Erin. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Why would she try to escape now? Had his words been meaningless to her, or was she running because she feared the war would never end? As Jackson and his team reached the outer perimeter of the defense grid, the reality of the situation hit him. The Xeon forces were closing in, their advanced weaponry overwhelming his team's defenses. Time was running out. In a moment of clarity, Jackson realized that if they lost the grid, everything they had fought for would be lost. Humanity would be vulnerable to a complete Xeon takeover. But what if, just maybe, there was a way to save more than just the grid? What if he could save Erin, too? Not just as a prisoner, but as a potential ally. He had to try. The choice of loyalty. The air was thick with smoke, the sounds of battle echoing through the shattered streets. Jackson's pulse raced as his team fought to hold the line against the advancing Xeon forces. The defense grid was within reach, but the overwhelming onslaught of alien soldiers was relentless. His heart was torn, not only by the immediate danger, but also by the situation with Erin. He had promised himself that after the battle, he would confront whatever was happening with her. But now, more than ever, he wondered if the choices he had made, and the ones he was about to make, could change the course of not just the war, but their entire future. With every passing moment, the battle seemed to intensify. The Xeon had overwhelming firepower, and humanity was on the defensive. Jackson's team was trying to buy enough time for their reinforcements to arrive, but it felt like the world was slipping away. As the dust and smoke swirled around him, Jackson couldn't help but feel a deep, gnawing sense of urgency. His mind wasn't just on the war anymore. It was on Erin, the alien soldier who, despite everything, had shown him a glimpse of something else, a path that was fraught with danger, but one that might lead to peace. The sounds of gunfire intensified, and Jackson snapped back to the present. He was at the heart of the action now, coordinating his troops, using every bit of tactical knowledge he had to push back the Xeon forces. But something felt different. It wasn't just the weight of the battle pressing down on him. It was the burden of the choice he was now faced with. Back at the military base, Erin's situation was far from stable. Her attempts to escape had not gone unnoticed, and the officers in charge were growing increasingly suspicious of her motives. After all, she was a prisoner, a war enemy, and any signs of cooperation were met with swift retaliation. But in the quiet moments when no one was watching, when the guards had their backs turned, Erin felt the pull of a decision that could change everything. She knew she was running out of time. The Xeon would not allow failure, and if her capture had been a mistake, she would be punished severely. But Erin wasn't just thinking about her own survival anymore. She couldn't ignore what Jackson had said. Could she betray everything she had been taught? Could she be more than just a weapon? As she paced in her cell, a strange thought emerged from the depths of her mind. A thought that had been growing ever since Jackson had begun talking to her, really talking. What if the war didn't have to be won by bloodshed? What if there was another way? Erin had spent her entire life believing that destruction was the only path for her people. The Xeon had been at war for centuries, and she was born to fight, to conquer. But with each passing day, Jackson's words began to resonate with her. The idea that she could choose her own path, that she could fight for something beyond war, was too powerful to ignore. She turned away from the small window of her cell, her gaze hardened with resolve. There was no turning back now. Erin had made a decision, one that might cost her everything, but it was a decision she was willing to make. Back on the front lines, Jackson's mind never stopped racing. The situation was growing direr by the second. The Xeon forces had breached their first line of defense, and the clock was ticking. Jackson's comm unit crackled with a message from his superior. "Reyes, we need you to fall back and regroup. This fight is lost if we don't make a stand at the secondary grid. Our forces are being overwhelmed." Jackson gritted his teeth. He didn't want to retreat. He couldn't, not when the defense grid was so close to falling. But as his mind raced, another thought emerged, a thought that took him completely by surprise. What if he wasn't just fighting for Earth anymore? What if there was a way to bring an end to this cycle of destruction, not just for humanity, but for Erin's people as well? The idea felt almost too radical to consider, but as he thought about Erin, about her quiet words and her uncertainty, Jackson realized that perhaps he had been looking at the conflict all wrong. It wasn't just about winning. It was about breaking the cycle, about showing Erin and others like her that peace was worth fighting for, even at the cost of everything they had been taught. As Jackson stood there, preparing to give the order for his squad to retreat to the secondary grid, a new message came through on his comm. It wasn't from his superiors, but from an unexpected source. "Captain Reyes." The voice was urgent, with a hint of fear. "It's me, Erin." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. Erin. How had she managed to get through? "Erin," he said, unable to hide the surprise in his voice. "Where are you? What's going on?" "I've made my choice, Jackson." Her voice was low, but resolute. I can't just be a weapon anymore. I've sent word to my people, but if I don't make it out of here, I'm asking you to help me. Jackson's mind spun. He could feel the weight of her words, the risk she was taking. He had always known Erin was more than just a soldier, but now she was asking him to trust her, to help her escape. "What do you want me to do?" Jackson asked, his voice tight with the enormity of the decision. "I need you to meet me," Erin replied quickly. "There's a way out. I have a plan. I don't know if it will work, but if it does, we can stop this war. We can stop everything. But I need you, Jackson. I need you to choose. Choose to help me, or we will all lose." For the first time, Jackson understood the true meaning of her words. The war wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a fight for the future, for the possibility of a new path. And now, in this moment of crisis, Jackson had to make the ultimate choice. As Jackson looked around him, the weight of his decision was unbearable. The battle was still raging. His mission was at stake, but Erin had given him a chance to change everything. He made his choice. "Tell me where to go," Jackson said firmly. "I'm coming for you, Erin. And together, we'll end this." A desperate alliance. The seconds felt like hours as Jackson made his decision. The battlefield was still raging around him, but his mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on the radio transmission with Erin. She had taken an enormous risk by reaching out to him. It was clear that if they were going to make this work, if they were going to end this war and stop the cycle of violence, it would require everything they had: trust, courage, and a willingness to walk into the unknown. "Jackson, listen to me." Erin's voice crackled over the comm, sharp and urgent. "I'm not asking you to risk your life for me. I'm asking you to help me stop the destruction. The Zeon won't listen to anyone else, but they'll listen to you. You're human, and they underestimate you. This is our only chance." Jackson swallowed hard, his breath steady but his pulse quickening. He knew the gravity of what she was suggesting. If they failed, it would mean not only their deaths, but the death of any chance for peace between their worlds. But the alternative, a world consumed by endless fighting, was a future Jackson refused to accept. "I'm on my way," Jackson said, his voice resolute. "Stay alive. I'm not leaving without you." The line went silent for a moment before Erin's voice came through again, softer this time, with a note of gratitude. "Thank you, Jackson. This means everything." Jackson quickly issued orders to his squad, directing them to take defensive positions while he went on his mission to reach Erin. The soldiers were confused but trusted their captain. They knew him well enough to understand that this wasn't some impulsive decision, but a calculated risk. Jackson's determination was their beacon, and if he was willing to take this gamble, they had no choice but to follow. With the city's communications grid under attack and the Zeon forces advancing, Jackson knew they had little time. He left the battlefield behind, moving through the debris-filled streets with a single-minded focus. Each step brought him closer to the hidden location where Erin had arranged to meet. It wasn't far, an abandoned research facility on the outskirts of the city. The air around him was thick with smoke and the distant echoes of explosions. The weight of the mission was suffocating, but he couldn't afford hesitation. The further Jackson moved from his unit, the more isolated he felt. His thoughts kept drifting back to Erin, to the woman who had started as his enemy but had now become something far more complicated. She wasn't just an alien soldier. She was someone who had seen the futility of war and had chosen to fight for something else. She had seen the cracks in the Zeon's ideology, just as Jackson had seen the flaws in humanity's blind push for victory. They were both trapped in a world of endless cycles, but together they could break free. Jackson's comm unit buzzed again. "Captain Reyes," it was one of his soldiers. "The Zeon are closing in on the main defense grid. We can't hold them off much longer." "I know," Jackson replied tersely, trying to keep his mind focused. "Just hold them as long as you can." "I'm almost there. When Jackson reached the research facility, the building loomed in front of him like a ghost of the past, its windows shattered and its walls crumbling. The once impressive structure now lay in ruins, the remnants of what had been a cutting-edge scientific center now serving as a makeshift hideout. Jackson approached cautiously, knowing that any sound, any movement, could be a signal for the Xeon to find them. He slipped through the shattered entrance and into the darkened interior, his rifle raised, scanning every corner. "Erin," Jackson called softly into the darkness, his voice low but firm. "Over here," came the reply. Erin's voice, unmistakably her own, echoed through the empty halls. Jackson followed the sound, moving swiftly but silently. He turned a corner and saw her standing by a set of large metal doors, her hands still bound, but her expression resolute. Her silver eyes flickered toward him as he approached, and for the first time in days, Jackson saw a glimmer of hope in her face. She wasn't the cold, unfeeling soldier from their first meeting. She had become something more, something human. "I didn't think you'd actually come," she said, her voice laced with surprise, but it wasn't mocking. There was a hint of warmth there, something that softened the tension between them. "You underestimated me," Jackson replied with a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. The stakes were too high for humor. "Are you ready to get out of here?" Erin nodded, but there was something in her eyes, something that told Jackson this wasn't just about escape anymore. It was about survival, not just for them, but for both their people. "I have a plan," she said, her voice steady, "but it's risky. The Xeon are closing in on the city, and I've sent word to my people. If we don't act fast, this is all for nothing." Jackson's heart pounded in his chest as he listened. "What do you need me to do?" Erin's eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to slow down. "I need you to trust me," she said simply. They made their way through the facility's back halls, Erin guiding him to a hidden control room. Inside, a set of ancient consoles hummed quietly, flickering to life as she began to tap into the system. This facility was once used for research on energy weapons and defense systems, she explained. "I've managed to access their old databanks. If we can activate the central core, we might be able to send a signal strong enough to interfere with the Xeon's communications network. It won't be permanent, but it'll buy us enough time for both sides to rethink this war." Jackson nodded, understanding the enormity of the task at hand. If they could disrupt the Xeon's communications, it might just be the leverage they needed to negotiate a ceasefire. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. As Erin worked the console, Jackson kept a watchful eye on the door. Time was running out, and the sounds of the Xeon approaching grew louder. He knew they didn't have long before the enemy would be on their doorstep. "Erin, how long?" Jackson asked, his voice urgent. "Almost there," she replied, her fingers flying over the keys. "Just give me a few more seconds." Jackson could feel the weight of every second as it passed, the tension building with every sound of approaching footsteps. And then, just as the door at the far end of the hall slammed open, Erin's voice rang out, full of triumph. "Done." With a loud roar, a massive blast of energy surged through the facility, the console flickering to life as a pulse of energy shot out toward the sky. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The war outside, the chaos, the uncertainty, it all stopped as the signal raced across the battlefield, jamming the Xeon's communications. Jackson breathed a sigh of relief, but it was only temporary. They had bought themselves time. But the real fight, the fight for peace, was just beginning.